We had no way to get advice on how to start a business. We were completely clueless. I think we probably, at one point, my brother and I counted that there were 5 times when we almost went bankrupt. And at least 3 of those were completely avoidable if we had had high quality advice. And a big part of the technology transfer platforms that are being spun up provide that high quality advice. So at least the avoidable problems can be avoided by the technology startups.
Welcome to the Transfer Files, inside the world of federal innovation. This is your insider's look at how federal laboratories bring groundbreaking technologies to market. I'm your host, Andrea Nelson. In every episode, we'll bring you insights and expertise from throughout the world of tech transfer. Today's guest is someone who truly embodies the intersection of scientific discovery and public policy. Congressman Bill Foster is a physicist, a former scientist at Fermilab, and now a representative for Illinois' 11th District. He brings a rare and invaluable perspective to Congress as the only PhD scientist currently serving in the House of Representatives. In this episode, we talk about how his background in research influences his work on science and tech policy, why federal innovation is critical to U.S. competitiveness, and what it takes to connect breakthrough ideas with real-world impact. Plus, find out how he earned the nickname Damn Fast Foster. Please enjoy my conversation with Congressman Bill Foster. Congressman Foster, thank you so much for being here with us.
Happy to be here.
Now, you're the only PhD physicist in Congress, and you had a successful career as a scientist before entering politics. So can you tell me about what inspired you to transition from physics to public service?
Oh, sure. Well, in the 25 years before I entered Congress, I worked at Fermi National Accelerator Laboratory, where we were smashing protons and antiprotons together to make particles that haven't been around since the Big Bang. I was actually on the team that discovered the top quark, the heaviest known form of matter, a single subatomic particle that weighs more than an atom of gold. And I also helped build the giant particle accelerators. If you fly into O'Hare from the west, if you look down, you'll see these 2 giant rings. In one of those 2 big circular tunnels is a machine that I invented and led the teams that built the magnets for it. So I had a real scientific career at Fermi National Accelerator Lab. And now in Congress, I'm proud to represent about half of Fermilab because of the way the map works, and 100% of Argonne National Laboratory, the first and really one of the very flagship national laboratories in the country.
Wow, you have a deep background with our federal labs. And so how does that background in science and innovation shape how you approach your policymaking?
Well, before I was actually in science, I was in business. When I was 19 years old, my little brother and I started a company that now manufactures about 2/3 of all the theater lighting equipment in the United States. So we're 90% of the lights on Broadway, 50% of touring rock and roll equipment, but 60% of just churches, schools, community theaters use our company's equipment. So we started that actually at the dawn of the microprocessor era. And when I look back at it, some of the resources that we were using there came from the fact that I had a job working for the University of Wisconsin in the plasma physics lab, which the Department of Energy supported. And among other things, they let me onto a computer that was hosted at Oak Ridge National Lab, which meant nothing to me back then as a 19-year-old kid who had this neat summer job. But we're able to use that to look at some feasibility studies for whether we had a chance of making a theater lighting control system with the newly invented microprocessor. And everyone at the plasma physics lab was really interested in microprocessors because they were brand new back then. And so I built actually a macro assembler that allowed you to actually program these things, which everyone was thrilled about. And then that was one of the technologies that allowed us to spin off and start our own private company. We actually started with in my basement with $500 from my parents. And then we got kicked out of the basement when when we were making too big a mess. And so we moved up to my bedroom. And then when we got our first order for equipment, we moved into a tiny little metal shed in a cornfield. And now it's a great big building in a cornfield with about 1,500 employees and about $450 million a year. But one of the things I'm most proud of is actually it's now 50 years ago, and on about its 50th anniversary, we transferred to an employee stock ownership plan, and that business is now 100% owned by the employees who built it. And so it's, I think it's a big success for private enterprise. And I had not until recently remembered how crucial it was to have access to the computer at Oak Ridge National Labs, which I'm sure there was no formal agreement or technology transfer policy. We just kind of used it back then. But it's, a limited amount of that is actually okay, because I'm sure the plasma physics laboratory benefited a lot from the work we did for them as well. And so it's a very healthy aspect of scientific research when you're doing it mostly out of the love of science, but then you have this idea that you can say, we can do our science much more efficiently. And then it occurs to you, you can do business much more efficiently with that same set of technologies. And having a pathway that allows you to, rapidly spin up a business on a lab-developed concept is really one of the most important differences now, where we have programs set up that deliberately encourage laboratory scientists or just scientists that are getting funded by the federal government or whatever to not be shy about starting their business, because 50 years ago, we were just doing something crazy. Everyone thought we were nuts, and we had no way to get advice on how to start a business. We were completely clueless. I think we probably, at one point, my brother and I counted that there were 5 times when we almost went bankrupt. Oh. And at least three of those were completely avoidable if we had high quality advice. And a big part of the technology transfer platforms that are being spun up provide that high quality advice. So at least the avoidable problems can be avoided by the technology startups.
Absolutely. So 50 years ago, it's a nice round number. And just last year, FLC celebrated 50 years of existence. And so that was really wild west of tech transfer days when, like you said, probably no agreement.
Oh, that's right. Well, we were one of the first customers of this other startup you may have heard of called Microsoft.
Oh, I think so.
At the time, Microsoft was just, Bill Gates and a few of his friends down in Arizona, I believe. And so we would call them, we were using their Fortran compiler. And so we would call them up with bugs in their Fortran compiler, and they'd say, we don't have any, blah, 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 blah. And we'd say, okay. And it was all long distance. So you'd sit there paying, $2 a minute on long distance and dictate a 5-line program. And then they'd run the compiler on it, look at the assembly language output and say, oh, you're right. And then they would mail us a brand new 8-inch floppy disk with a compiler bug fixed. And so this was, it was the Wild West, but really a great time for startup. Whenever technology is moving really rapidly, that's the time when you can really find a new niche that's completely unexplored and rapidly spin up a significant business. And, back then it was the newly invented microprocessor. I think AI is really in an analogous position right now, where someone with a really good idea can rapidly implement it and scale it. And the labs have a huge role in that. One of the important roles of the labs is to work on technologies before they are ready for commercialization. Back when I was working at Fermi National Lab, back in the 1990s, we were programming neural networks, the core technology behind artificial intelligence. And frankly, then it didn't work. Because mostly because the computers we had were just so wimpy, literally millions of times wimpier than what's available on a GPU chip today. And so it was hopeless from that point of view. But we did a lot of working on algorithms to try to get them to do something useful. And we also ran into what's now called the explainability problem. That if we thought about what would it take if we want to publish a paper that said, we have discovered a new subatomic particle because our neural network says so. All right. really, how do you even read such a paper? How do you evaluate whether it was done correctly? And where I now serve on the Financial Services Committee on the House of Representatives, where I was chairing the AI task force in previous Congresses. And so one of the issues we struggled with was the explainability problem. If someone says, I'm sorry, your mortgage has been turned down because our neural network says so, how do you explain that? Is that an acceptable answer? And it's the exact same problem. And having a national lab and scientists at universities working at national labs that have been discussing that problem for the last 25 years gives you a real leg up when the policy issues come to the forefront.
Mm-hmm. And that is, you've mentioned a few different pieces that are critical to the puzzle. There's the policy infrastructure, there's funding opportunities, there's access to advice, like you mentioned. So how do you approach any or all of those pieces to really strengthen the potential for public-private partnerships that can accelerate commercialization out of the federal labs?
Well, one of the real core functions of national laboratories is to provide industrial cooperation and coordination, and it comes about in a couple ways. The first thing is when you need a facility like the Advanced Photon Source at Argonne National Lab or the other advanced facilities that really no single business can or should build by itself. But by giving access to dozens of the many beamlines and these synchrotron light sources to individual companies, the companies can have their little siloed research operation, and yet still go to the laboratory cafeteria and talk with the other people working in their same commercial field and have some sort of cross-pollination there. And so they really end up being very useful. Or the nanotechnology facilities that are spun up at many laboratories, a similar thing. And so that's a very valuable thing that has to do really with supporting existing companies as they wish to just investigate technologies without being able to make the investment. There's another class of things having to do with data sharing. The national laboratories, particularly the weapons labs, have a long history of guarding very carefully important data sets. And in developing a lot of software like AI systems to support medical research, the individual medical databases are things that have to be guarded very, very carefully because of the privacy concerns. Mm-hmm. And so that's one of the things, for example, that Argonne National Lab is involved in is being sort of the steward of medical databases that can be searched in ways that don't violate patients' privacy. And you need an enforcer for the privacy protection, and yet allow you to access the records across many different sources and many different companies to get the whole picture of the patient's medical history and some idea of whether certain kinds of medical interventions will work well in those patients or not. And so it's another very valuable thing that I think will really be growing because of the sort of double-edged sword of AI, where it works better with more data, but can invade a lot more privacy with access to too much data. And so that's, I think, really going to be a growth opportunity for the national labs and the businesses that collaborate with national labs to get safe access to those data sets.
And then can you connect the dots for us just with your experience and your position on the Financial Services Committee and the R&D Caucus? How does now all this public-private partnership feed into economic growth and the national economic strategy and competitiveness?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting thing being a physicist on the Financial Services Committee because I came onto the Financial Services Committee in March of 2008, right before the whole economy collapsed. And when people said, "What the heck happened here?" A lot of it were pretty, sort of garbage mortgages. Mortgages that were issued with no belief that people could ever repay them. But then all of these mortgages that were in fact near worthless as an economic asset because they were never going to get paid. were then bundled and sliced and diced, much of it done by physicists or former physicists who made these structured financial products. They went off and worked on Wall Street, made these very complicated financial instruments that, in fact, pretty much hid the risk of financial collapse. And a lot of the very sophisticated quantitative trading is actually done by former physicists who understand statistics and signal to noise and everything else that is now kind of second nature to the electronic trading markets, was brand new, 30 or 40 years ago. And so these, they've been very successful electronic trading firms built really on the backs of physicists and mathematicians. But then when things went wrong back in 2008, it was very valuable to have at least one physicist on the committee who could understand these structured financial products and try to write the rules of the road so that this sort of collapse cannot happen again. And the rules are not simple because the things they're trying to regulate are not simple. But it was one of the places where I felt valuable on financial services.
When it comes to the challenges facing U.S. science and technology leadership, what would you say are some of the biggest challenges and also some of the most crucial actions for strengthening that leadership?
Well, one of the biggest challenges is to try to do something reasonable with international collaboration, because there is a lot of sort of anti-China rhetoric going around now. A lot of it for very good reasons. Our company was a victim of Chinese intellectual property theft, where we saw cloned products. There's a lot of bad things that happen because they don't regulate their businesses in ways that the United States has for generations. And there are problems there. There are problems, certainly always security problems at the weapons labs that we always have to take seriously. But there are also, there's a danger. One of the things I'm most proud of is that Fermi National Accelerator Lab, where I worked for most of my career, one of the things that Fermilab is most proud of, their founding director would brag about it all the time, Bob Wilson, that in the heart of the Cold War, when Fermilab was founded, some of the very first experiments had Russian collaborators on them. And this is something I think we should be proud of forever. Frankly, CERN in particular during the Cold War was sort of a nest of spies. If you ever had Russian collaborators on your experiment, there was always one guy, a bunch of brilliant physicists, and there was one guy who really didn't know much physics, and he was their KGB minder. Okay. And it was sort of a standing joke, and everyone knew it. I mean, the only thing that he was really good at was drinking with the rest of the Russians. And so this is, that's something where we have to understand the trade-offs. Right now, I think we're frankly making a mistake in pushing a lot of new PhD graduates, really from around the world, from China, but also from around the world, pushing them out of the United States with a lot of the xenophobic rhetoric and just the unreasonable policies. One of the things that really broke my heart at Fermilab is that we lost one of the best accelerator physicists that we've ever had because of our immigration policy as relate to gay marriage, okay, which back then said, okay, I'm sorry, that makes it impossible for you to really make a home in the U.S. if you were had a gay marriage. And so it just, that sort of stuff, it was part of the reason I decided to leave physics and get into politics is that when you see things that are clearly wrong that are being done, you can either sit there and complain about it, or you can just decide to spend part of your life making the system better.
Do you ever miss, not that being in politics isn't hands-on, but it's different. Do you miss using that other part of your brain?
Oh, all the time. I still do a little bit of computing to keep my brain from rotting and to just sort of to just track the progress of AI and all these code writing assistants and stuff, which are just amazing. And it actually helps me appreciate, when you talk about artificial intelligence and the threat to people's livelihood, I've talked to auto workers who will describe how proud they were that when the car ran down the assembly line, they could make a perfect weld every time with a perfect bead on every car coming down the line. And then one day the company installed a welding robot that did that job perfectly every time for a fraction of what they had been being paid. And I get that same feeling when I look at these coding assistants. Like one of the things that I was most proud of, my PhD experiment, at Fermilab, I sort of had the nickname of Damn Fast Foster because I wrote these programs that ran 100 times faster than anyone else's, which is a very valuable skill in your experiment. And so, but now I look at these coding assistants and the incredible compilers. Our company existed and thrived because I could write assembly language just better than anyone else. That squeezing the most performance out of these microprocessors that more than people could believe. But now they have compilers that do that better than I can because they understand the whole instruction pipeline. You have these coding assistants where you just describe the product that you want, and boom, it will produce a finished product tested with synthesized data sets to make sure it's working the way you described. And that's going to change. It's going to change science, and it's going to change industry too. One way to describe this is this AI agents will be sort of the equivalent of having an infinite number of really good remote workers that you can describe a project to, and they will come back and give you the finished product, but not in 2 weeks, but in 2 hours or 2 minutes, depending on what the project is. And that's going to change everything. We'll have to rethink, the value of human intellect. And, having some of the leading research on that, done in national labs will sort of anchor us away from the chaos of commercial competition that just, where one company's up and then the next company's up and then, everything that's happening. But having this flywheel of competence in the national labs so that as technologies come and go in fashion, that you still have a core expertise.
That makes a lot of sense. That was very well put. And for a final sort of word, what advice would you give to researchers, entrepreneurs, and industry leaders who would like to engage more with policymakers and advocate for science-driven policies?
Well, the first thing to do is, if you're trying to influence Congress, to make an appointment with your member of Congress or your senator back in your home state. It is, lots of groups get very excited. Oh, we're going to go to Washington, D.C., and we're going to knock on our doors. And so that, during the day, there's this stream of 15-minute meetings with groups that come in. In fact, in just a few minutes, I have to go off to a meeting like that. And so that, if you don't come into this business with attention deficit disorder, you rapidly develop it. But when you're back home in your home state, if you have a meeting, it could be a half hour or an hour long meeting. And if a member of Congress meets with scientists or tech firms that are in their district or in their state, they will listen to them in ways that they won't if you just come knock on your door in Washington, where there's a danger that scientists will be viewed as just another special interest group. And so this is, let them see your excitement about, either starting up your company or the research you're engaged in. And very often that research is not done in the hometown. There can be universities who do research at a national lab that's an airplane flight away. And that still, the member of Congress should understand that there is a value in that, even though it doesn't happen to be in his or her congressional district. That these are really national resources that we have to guard and preserve very carefully in rather uncertain times right now.
Very much so. Well, Congressman Foster, thank you so much again for your time and your insight. Thanks again to Congressman Foster for generously sharing his time and knowledge. And thank you for listening and spreading the word about this podcast. Subscribe and listen to more episodes on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform. Check the show notes or the episode page at federallabs.org for links to resources and information that comes up in our conversation. Thanks to our producer and digital marketing manager, Carly Dunow, graphics manager, Danny Batchelor, web content and systems manager, Jess Klein, and the FLC staff and community for your support. We'll see you back in 2 weeks on Transfer Files Tuesday. Thanks for tuning in to the Transfer Files, your insider's look at federal tech transfer. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay connected for more episodes exploring how hundreds of government laboratories and countless industry partners are driving innovations that shape our lives.